Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 26, The Aussie Dickens Brothers. I became interested in the sons of Charles Dickens who came to Australia as I found reference to one working at LOR, which was a property near Hay in New South Wales. Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens, known as Plorn to the family, was the youngest son of Charles Dickens and his wife Catherine, and he was born on the 13th of March 1852. He was born when his father and mother were about to be estranged. Lord Lytton was his godfather. The first Earl of Lytton's full name was Edward Robert Bulwer Lytton, hence Edward's name and his middle name. And he was an English statesman, a conservative politician and a poet who used the pseudonym Owen Meredith. He was the Viceroy of India, and that was when Queen Victoria proclaimed to be the Empress of India. He served as the British ambassador to France, and his parents were the novelists Edward Bulwer Lytton, the first Baron Lytton, and Rosina Doyle Wheeler. Edward Dickens came to Australia in 1868 to join his brother Alfred, a stock and station agent living in Melbourne. Their father encouraged them to migrate as he saw Australia as a land of opportunity, a utopia. Charles visualised all the poor in England flocking out here to an idyllic place where they could live on little plots of land. However, in his father's opinion, the boys lacked application and staying power, and he thought it would be remedied by a colonial experience. Charles wrote to Alfred, Edward's older brother, asking him to help his younger brother. He added that his younger brother could ride, he could do a little carpentering and make a horseshoe, but raised doubts about whether he could take to life on the bush. In his parting letter to his son, Charles Dickens says, "I need not tell you that I love you dearly and am very, very sorry in my heart to part with you. But this life is half made up of partings, and these pains must be borne. It is my comfort and my sincere conviction that you are going to try the life for which you are best fitted. I think its freedom and wildness more suited to you than any experiment in a study or office would have been, and without that training you could have followed no other suitable occupation. What you have always wanted until now has been a steady, constant purpose. I therefore exhort you to persevere in a thorough determination to do whatever you have to do as well as you can do it. I was not so old as you are now when I first had to win my food, and to do it out of this determination, and I have never slackened it since. Never take a mean advantage of anyone in any transaction, and never be hard upon people who are in your power." And after advice about religious matters, he concludes, "I hope you will always be able in afterlife to say you had a kind father. You cannot show your affection for him so well or make him so happy as by doing your duty." After Edward landed in Melbourne on board the Sussex in December 1868, he did not stay in the city long as a job was lined up for him. On the 26th of December, it was reported widely in the newspapers that he was embarking on squatting pursuits in the Riverina. This was stretching the truth a little bit, as 3 months short of his 17th birthday, in January 1869, he set off at LOR near Hay, a large property that was in southern New South Wales. And he wasn't going to be a squatter, he was going to work on the property. But he was back in Melbourne only 10 days later, claiming the station manager was no gentleman. It certainly would have been a harsh environment for the son of a well-off literature genius to come into such a desolate area. His second placement was at Mombas Station on the Darling River near Wilcannia, New South Wales, owned by E.S. Bonney and Co. He took up a managing position at Mount Murchison Station, also owned by Bonney, and he remained there until 1881. He purchased a share in Yanda Station near Burke, New South Wales, using his inheritance. However, he lost heavily from bad seasons, which forced him to sell. Charles Dickens wrote a letter to his oldest son, Alfred, and it shows his anxiety towards Edward, or Plorn as they called him. "I am doubtful whether Plorn is taking to Australia. Can you find out his real mind? I notice that he always writes as if his present life were the be-all and end-all of his immigration, and as if I had no idea of you two becoming proprietors and aspiring to the first positions in the colony without casting off the old connection. This was the last letter to his sons before Alfred received the letter. The news of his father Charles's death was telegraphed. That was in 1870. After the death of his father, Edward's maternal aunt sent a regular allowance. By 1874, he was a JP. He captained a cricket team and raced his stud horses Greytail, Tam O'Shanter, Dusky Morn and Snowdrop. Women were in short supply on the Darling, and Edward contemplated going back to England to look for a bride, but he met and married Constance de Sally. Constance was known to belong to one of the most prominent families in Melbourne and was the daughter of the owner of Natali Station, a nearby property. They married in 1880 and had no children. She suffered at least 2 miscarriages. The marriage notice reads, Dickens to Sally, on the 7th at the residence of the bride's parents by the Reverend D.D. Rutledge, Edward Bulwer Lytton, youngest son of the late Charles Dickens, to Constance Emily Rose, second daughter of Alfred D'Orsay of Natali Wilcannia, New South Wales. The match must have been considered quite a coup for the D'Orsay family. Bit of Constance's background. Constance was born in 1859 at Wilcannia and was a descendant of Daniel Stanfield Jr., a Marine who came out on the Supply in the First Fleet. He was born at Peterborough, England in 1766 and was reputed to come from an English naval family. He was promoted to corporal around the time that he married Alice Mansfield, who was the widow of a fellow Marine, Thomas Harmsworth, in Sydney Town in 1791 by Richard Johnson, the first chaplain. Thomas Harmsworth was born about 1750 in Barkway, Hertfordshire, England, and he married Alice Mansfield on the 25th of June 1780 in Barkway. Alice was the daughter of John Mansfield and Elizabeth Beadle, and she was born on the 6th of November 1754 in Barkway. Thomas and Alice Harmsworth made the voyage from Plymouth, England, and arrived in Sydney Cove with the First Fleet aboard the Prince of Wales. Thomas was a private in the Royal Marine Corps and on arrival was assigned to the Port Jackson garrison. Travelling with Thomas and Alice on the voyage was their daughter Anne, who was born in 1782 in England, and their son Thomas, born in 1784. Thomas died soon after arrival on the 24th of February 1788, and Thomas Senior then died of diarrhoea and fever in Sydney Cove on the 30th of April 1788. Another son, John, was born on the voyage on the 17th of December 1787. Thomas Harmsworth, while having a very brief life in the new colony, had created history by being the father of Thomas Harmsworth Jr., who was the first free settler from the First Fleet to die on Australian soil, and his brother John was the last free settler on the First Fleet to die on Australian soil. So Alice, being a widow, then married Daniel Stanfield, and less than a month after Daniel and Alice's marriage, they were transferred to Norfolk Island and had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. In 1794, after 4 years' service, Daniel was discharged from the Marines and they returned to Port Jackson. He was sworn in as a constable and then they moved to Tasmania. He started farm at Little Cascade and was awarded with 2 goats from Lieutenant Governor Philip Gidley King, who described him as a deserving settler. Stanfield decided to enlist in the New South Wales Corps, and in November he sailed on the Daedalus for Port Jackson. Next October he was returned to Norfolk Island in the Supply with his wife, 4 children and a promised 60-acre land grant. By 1804 he had 5 children, 30 sheep, and of his 120 acres, 35 was under cultivation. It is interesting to note that in Walker's History of Tasmania, Daniel Stanfield's name appears as one of the first recommended by Major Fourveau at Norfolk Island as the most industrious and fittest to send to the then new colony of Van Diemen's Land. Being a man of excellent physique and courage, descended from a naval family who had fought for their country, no better selection could have been made. With the evacuation of Norfolk Island planned, Governor King suggested that Stanfield and his children should remain and encouraged him by offering additional land from expired leases on the island. However, keen and determined, he sailed with his family in the city of Edinburgh and arrived at Hobart Town in October 1808. In that same year, he took up land at Greenpoint near Bridgewater, Tasmania. It was on the banks of the Derwent River, and Daniel showed unmistakable foresight. He built a big homestead, which he valued at more than £2,000, which stood for over a century, close to the springs of water, and the property was in close proximity to the new settlement Hobart Town. Its splendid soil is still recognised as one of the best farms in Tasmania. His was the first land to be ploughed in Tasmania. He was allowed under agreement with the authorities to take 2 acres for each one given up at Norfolk Island. He added to the grant by purchases from the Crown and acquired large tracts of land in the Clarence, Broadmarsh, Oatlands and Fingal districts. By February 1825 he had 1,200 acres and had purchased 890 acres more. He had 1,000 cattle, 800 sheep, 10 horses, a flour mill and other capital. In 1826, the Greenpoint homestead was held up by Michael Howe, the bushranger that was discussed in episode 18, Theo's Duty, by Ray Blair. Daniel attacked them with a bayonet and was wounded. That same year he was summoned to Hobart to give evidence against the bushrangers due to the goods stolen from him, but he died there suddenly of a heart seizure at the Maypole Inn at Newtown on the 4th of February, leaving a very numerous and opulent family. Part of his tombstone can be seen at St David's Park, Hobart. His wife Alice died in October 1830, and both deaths are registered at St David's. Constance was connected via their son Daniel Jr.'s line, who inherited his father's land grants. His daughter married Alfred D'Orsay. Constance's grandfather, Francis Wisdom D'Orsay, was a surgeon who was appointed after emigrating in 1821 to Hobart. He also received land grants in Tasmania. Constance's father, Alfred, moved to the mainland to farm, firstly at Steam Plains near Conago, southern New South Wales, then to Wilcannia, where Constance and Edward met.
Alfred's sister Caroline married Dr. Erasmus Wren in Hobart in November 1841. It's quite possible that Caroline's father and Erasmus Wren worked together in Hobart. Dr. Wren was a doctor in Deniliquin from 1860, which could have encouraged Constance's brother Alfred to purchase land near Conago.
In 1881, long after their marriage, Edward and Constance returned to Melbourne, and Edward established E.B.L. Dickens & Co., a stock and station agency in Collins Street. In 1881, Edward and Constance returned to Melbourne, and he established E.B.L. Dickens & Co., a stock and station agency, with his brother Alfred in Collins Street. By 1882, he was back in Wilcannia, setting up a branch office there and leaving the city business to his brother Alfred. He then nominated for the seat of Wentworth at the 1882 by-election, but withdrew before the polls. He had money problems. Appeals to his aunt for more funds was usually denied, and in 1884 his brother Henry sent him £800, a debt which he never repaid. In 1886-87 he was appointed Government Inspector of Runs in the Burke District. Financial relief came in March 1889 when he first represented Wilcannia in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, which had just voted an annual salary of £300 for its members. He held the seat until defeated by the Labor Party candidate Richard Sleeth in 1894. It is said, though, that he did not make a great name for himself as a parliamentarian. Edward then became a rabbit inspector for the government of New South Wales and was afterwards an officer for the Lands Department in charge of the Moree district. The next few years were restless ones for Constance and Edward, who spent time with Constance's sister near Broken Hill in Tasmania, and then they moved to Glebe in Sydney. In the late 1890s, they're recording as lodging at Toxteeth Mansion, Glebe, and his occupation was gentleman, which implied he was of good standing in society but also unemployed. He was supported by his wife, who became a typewriter in Martin Chambers Moore Street, which is now Martin Place. Edward invested in shares, however quite unsuccessfully, and applied for positions as far afield as Western Australia. Letters of support failed to secure the post of the Secretary to the Department for the Protection of Aborigines in that state. He sent a letter to the Melbourne-based author and historian George Rusden asking to be recommended to the Western Australian Premier. Rusden had helped Edward in the early days but was now retired with diminished influence. The response from Rusden was not encouraging. 10th of March 1898. My dear Plorn, I have just received a note from Sir J. Forrest, Premier of Western Australia, telling me that he has duly considered my letter, but that he fears there are too many resident applicants to permit him to go out of the colony for any appointment, and especially the one referred to, but that your application will be placed with others and have consideration when the appointment has to be made. Edward did not get the job. In June 1900, he was appointed a conditional purchase inspector, visiting country properties from his home base at the Criterion Hotel, Moree. It was in the Criterion that he died of tuberculosis on the 23rd of January 1902, leaving debts 4 times the value of his assets. He was 49 and buried in the Moree Cemetery in an unmarked grave. In the All Saints Church of England, there's a fine brass plate erected to his memory by the Dickens Fellowship. The Dickens Fellowship was founded in 1902, and it's a worldwide association of people from all walks of life who share a common interest in the life and works of Charles Dickens. The Fellowship's aim is to promote the knowledge and appreciation of Dickens's works and exercise charitable support as would have appealed strongly to the heart of Charles Dickens. A memorial to Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens, Charles Dickens's youngest son, after a life of good and evil fortune, is at rest in the graveyard of this town. An obelisk was erected by Mr. Gordon Williamson of Sydney, who was a cousin of Constance's, and an additional black granite plaque with some of the words in Gaelic have been placed on the grave. Edward was described by those who knew him as a likeable, fascinating fellow whose besetting sin was his love of gambling. His brother Charles described him as a amiable, shy, affectionate, but a boy of no real ability and, as it turned out, no real application or energy. Constance had nursed him through his long illness. She lived in Surrey Hills in Sydney after Edward's death. Little is known of her life in those final years. She seemed to move around a lot and probably staying in furnished rooms or with friends. There was an article in the paper announcing her death. Mrs. Constance Dickens, 54, a widow who, it is stated, was a daughter-in-law of Charles Dickens, a novelist, died in the Melbourne hospital on Saturday from heart failure. She was admitted to the hospital on April the 6th, suffering from alcoholism and cardiac failure. For a few days prior to her illness, she had been living at Newmarket. Constance was buried in an unmarked grave at Box Hill. It would have been a pauper's grave, but fortunately a benefactor, Mrs. Elizabeth Gaunt, paid for it. Later, the Dickens Society and descendant Robin da Costa Adams obtained permission for a memorial stone to be placed there, and the Desailly family contributed to the cost. Her will stated that she was late of Paulamacca Station, Broken Hill, but was temporarily living in Melbourne. And a little on Edward's brother Alfred D'Orsay Tennyson Dickens, known as Skittles to his family, was the 6th child and the 4th son of Charles Dickens. He was born on the 28th of October 1845 in London and was named after his godfathers Lord Tennyson and Count D'Orsay. Count D'Orsay was French, and he was described as a fashionable dandy who was also a talented amateur artist. He was born in Paris and was the son of one of Bonaparte's generals. Alfred Tennyson was the famous English poet of the Victorian era. Alfred failed in a number of professional and vocational choices, including careers in the military, medicine and business. After failing the entrance examination into the British Army Cadet Corps, Alfred spent several years studying the import-export business in a China house in London. Inevitably, with a taste of fashionable clothing, he ran up debts by using his father's name at various London tailors. Apparently, Dickens saw Alfred as something of a plodder, steady and hard-working, though not in the least brilliant, but hoped he would make something of himself far from home. Alfred departed for Australia from Paddington Station at the age of 19, arriving as an assisted immigrant on the London with letters of introduction. It was reported in Melbourne newspapers that he obtained the position of Judge's Associate in August 1865 as soon as he arrived. However, this mustn't have lasted long, because through introductions he then secured a position on a sheep station at Springdale in New South Wales, north of Wagga Wagga. In his later speaking tours, Alfred recounted how in the middle of the night, during his time at Springdale, he was called up to assist in the capture of Captain Bluecap and his gang, notorious bushrangers of the time, who haunted the nearby Narrabri Ranges. "I was never so excited in my life," Alfred recounted. But when I was told to take up a position at a crossroad on the fringe of the dense and frowning forest and to shoot the first man I saw coming out of it, I was scared to death. The minutes seemed hours, and every moment I expected to be shot at. I shall never forget the relief I felt when I heard a stock whip crack and one of the station hands call out that Blue Cap and his black fellow had been captured. After the death of his father in 1870, he used his inheritance to buy Wollongong Station near Forbes. This was not considered a great success, as he was an indifferent horseman and knew nothing about managing and handling stock. He recounted his experience of trying to ride buck jumpers while working as an estate manager. At my first attempt, I was sent whizzing through the air and had to be carried to the station casualty room suffering from a sprained ankle. In my second attempt, I found myself sitting in the middle of a road with a saddle between my legs. The failure could also be attributed to the prolonged drought. Alfred then became manager of Corona Station for a short time, which was on the border of New South Wales and South Australia. He returned to Melbourne and joined the London and Australian Corporation, whose warehouses and offices were situated in Collins Street, and was a financial agent with offices in the foyer of the Metropole Hotel in Burke Street. He showed great competency in accountancy, and he was in demand by squatters and businessmen for his services. He married Miss Augusta Jessie Devlin, daughter of Captain Devlin, who was said to be the belle of Melbourne, on the 13th of March 1873, and was very much a society wedding.
At a meeting of the directors of the Deniliquin and Moama Railway Company at their Collins Street office on the 26th of June 1874, Alfred Tennyson was appointed acting secretary. The family later moved to Hamilton, Victoria,
where Alfred took up a position as a station agent. The couple had 3 daughters, Catherine Mary, Violet and Jessie. Jessie died at the age of 2 in 1879 when there was a carriage accident, and 2-year-old Jessie and Augusta both died in that accident. After the death of his wife, he opened up the stock and station agency in Melbourne with his brother, and he married again to Emily Rebecca Riley in Melbourne on the 22nd of June 1888.
She was 17 years his junior.
It was not a happy match, and they had no children. However, Emily was stepmother to Alfred and Augusta's 2 girls, Kathleen and Violet. Financially, he'd used up his inheritance from his father when the Depression hit Victoria in the early 1890s, and he took up touring Australia, giving lectures on his father's life and work, and provided many amusing anecdotes of living with a great novelist. Inquiries revealed that Emily, over several years, had sold off certain property that was owned by her mother. The discovery was made by her sister Catherine after their mother had died in 1904. Emily said her actions were done at her husband's request. Alfred and Emily are recorded living together in 1909 in Fitzroy South. However, he left Australia in 1910 to give lectures in Europe and America, returning to Great Britain for the first time since 1865. He became Vice President of the Dickens Fellowship. When Emily was left behind, it left her penniless. She began working as a domestic servant for income for some years. Emily was admitted to hospital on February the 6th, 1913, suffering from pneumonia, and died on the 23rd of February. Although documents state she was buried in Melbourne Cemetery, there seems to be no record of her actually being buried in the family plot. And it was while he was in America in 1912 that during the Dickens centennial celebrations, he took ill and went to his room at the Astoria Hotel in New York City and died. Alfred's 2 daughters, Kathleen and Violet, were spinsters. Kathleen was a music teacher and Violet a nurse when they were living together in Hawkesburn, Victoria in 1913. Kathleen was a music teacher and Violet a nurse when they were recorded at living in Hawkesburn, Victoria in the census. They both boarded the SS Macedonia and arrived in England in June 1912, where they continued to live together and had close contact with the Dickens family. Alfred and Edward's brother, Henry Fielding Dickens, pointed out Alfred had been quite a stranger to the family from the time he went to Australia. He left 2 daughters who came over to this country some years ago and remain a great favourite with all of us. Kathleen died in October 1951 and Violet May in 1952. So with the best laid plans of their father, sending them out to the colony to make something of themselves, it seems that there were quite a few bumps that went along the way for Edward and Alfred. And in the end, no descendants of the Dickens family remained in Australia.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes